Yeah, let's get to work. This is episode 3 of Locked On Mordred, and we're going to be talking about Sekiro tonight because we already ranked all of the Soulsborns, and Sekiro has a very Soulsborne-like DNA while not being quite a Soulsborne.
Yeah, they kind of went off the res, so to speak, with some of the gameplay mechanics here, which I think is probably differing, one of the bigger, more differing aspects from this game from other Soulsborns.
Do you remember the cosmic whining about how hard the game was?
I mean,
Bunch
it
of
wasn't terribly unwarranted.
Well, the problem is that a bunch of these journalists came in with experience from Dark Souls, but you have to de-learn Dark Souls in order to really be able to
There
play
also
Sekiro.
is the fact that you could get away without having to parry anything in Dark Souls. In Sekiro, you have to parry.
And parrying's really not that easy. And now that
It's
you mention it, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
we're
No,
we're
go ahead.
going we're gonna be rating, not rating, but comparing Sekiro in four key aspects to the rest of the Soulsborne series. And we're gonna be talking a lot about parrying on the gameplay part of it, which is actually going to be the last part of it. But I wanted to start by talking about Sekiro's sound selection. What do you think about that?
Oh, I mean, it was excellent. I mean, as far as all these Soulsborns go, they tend to really knock it out of the park sound wise, to the point where you don't really even tell that much of a difference. But the sound, it really tries to play in with the gameplay mechanics. Like you have to wait for a certain sound to parry, or you wait for a certain sound to defend, and they just certain sounds that come up like something that's unblockable, and that's how they kind of tie it into the thing, which I think is interesting.
I did think that it sound effect wise, you're absolutely right. But I think there's one big difference in the sound music composition part of it, and it's that like you can get those kind of opera, sad opera undertones from all the other games, but this game is a lot more rooted in its Japanese origins, and the music is a lot more reminiscent of traditional Japanese music, while the rest of the Soulsborne music, to me, seems very European. What do you think about that?
I mean, that only makes sense, honestly. So you've got the big the big classical pieces that you hear from Dark Souls isn't really gonna fit very well into the background and setting of what Sekiro does. That being said, there probably were some points where the music probably could have been done a little better. I don't really have tons of opinions on that because music just to me in most games is just something that's you don't really you really only notice if it's not there or if it's bad. So
Well, I think that overall, um, Sekiro is actually one of the strongest musical compositions of the entire Soulsborne. I think we have a differing opinion of that, but my favorite, let's call it song of the entire Soulsborne genre, or from software games, since this isn't an outright Soulsborne, is actually the like sub boss or mid boss music that Sekiro had. I absolutely love it. I really like the Japanese undertone, but you are right that the music may not be as dynamic, so it's probably not as enjoyable or as memorable to most people. We're also we haven't mentioned the fact that as usual, most of the music is hidden behind some of the bigger boss encounters, which is fine. It's from software, it's a from software staple that I expect to also be applied to Elden Ring. But other than that, I think the sound effects, however, are excellently done and are integrated seamlessly into the gameplay because audio cues play a big part into the gameplay's DNA to the point where I was able to differentiate when I had a couple playthroughs under my belt whether a parry was a perfect parry or just a parry. It got to that point, and I think other sound effects like explosions and when bullets or cannonballs are being thrown at you, the sounds of the ninja tools and the sounds of you just jumping and using your prosthetic arm to swing around the stage are all top notch.
I agree. I agree for the most part.
Which brings me to the graphics. I think that the graphical definition of Sekiro is very much on par to what we see in both Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, which take very much advantage of the PS4's graphical capabilities. But I think they they are a bit more, let's call it, focused on, for example, the facial expressions of both the characters, the and your enemies, like the NPCs that are non-combative against you, and most of the enemies. I think that the quality of the facial expressions are much better in Sekiro than some of the other games. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, to follow up on that, you because you're not, in Dark Souls, your character can have so many. They have a character creator where you can be something whatever you want to look like, and then you have all these different armors and stuff that you can wear. So they have to be able to model that all that stuff right in front of you to a decent enough fidelity that it fits in with the rest of the game. But with Sekiro, you basically have the same clothes on the entire time. The only changes is your prosthetic arm. So they don't really have to spend as much uh, graphical horsepower, trying to uh, generate and just go over the different costumes that Sekiro might have. So that's kind of how they reallocate those resources elsewhere.
So yeah, I think that definitely helps a lot. But other than that, I also thought, there's actually a lot of variety to a certain degree in the amount of enemies you see per area. I don't think it's as much as, say, Bloodborne, but there's a lot of enemy variety. And I think that, for example, the facial expressions and the actual models of the enemies are a bit better presented. But that may have to do with the fact that they didn't have to put so much work on the player character on and other player characters because if you're doing some jolly cooperation or the shadows of the character that appear while you're running around, those that need to be so worked on is what I'm trying to say. So I think that graphically Sekiro is also in its own class as it pertains to the actual model of the area that you're in. In general, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to I wanted to bring up a point later on, but we are the what do you mean, like the clothing that he wears, or just kind of how he fits in with the setting?
Just I think three things: the clothing that you wear, the environments themselves, and how you fit in with the environments.
hmm So I think because Sekiro is kind of his own, he's the protagonist in this, which From Software doesn't usually do the entire story driven linear like hero protagonist kind of deal. They kind of wanted to have him differentiate with the background a little bit, just a little bit, just so he looks like he doesn't quite belong there, or that he's like some elite warrior, which he is. So that's something that they may have been going for when they were conceiving the game.
And you can see that that's also part of what seems to be so important regarding the, let's call it, the character models, the specificity of character models, because that game has something that may not be so easily seen in some of the other From Software games, even though it does appear to a certain extent, and it's that in general you can pretty much tell when an enemy is really strong just by looking at it. I think that in some of the other games, some enemies were deceptively weak, while some other enemies were deceptively strong. I don't think that's really a problem in Sekiro, and I think it's something they were going for specifically. I think that of all the Soulsborne games, this is better represented in Bloodborne instead of the rest of the Souls games, and I think that Sekiro really kicked it up a notch, and enemy variety certainly helps in this regard. But you can tell when an enemy is an elite as soon as you see it. You see a ninja guy with only that's only showing you one arm, and you're like, that guy's got to be really strong. Or you see those giant sumo fat guys with a giant sword, and you're like, that guy has to be really strong. And whenever you see someone with a spear, with how strong thrust attacks are in that game, and to
especially
the
early
point
on.
yeah, to the point that they even have a specific skill dedicated to being able to counter those. You immediately know like that guy is really strong, and I think that's very helpful for the type of game that Sekiro is, where you're encouraged to because I think there's a dichotomy in that game where they have that stealth element to it, which is also very visually implemented. But you also have to, in the end, go balls to the wall because you can't just stealth everything.
Yeah, definitely. I like the fact that they incorporated stealth in this because you're kind of they give you that element of verticality in this game that you don't get in other
Yes,
from software games.
which has a lot to do with the environment. But we're jumping ahead a little bit to the gameplay aspect, so I think we should segue, not a very good segue, into the lore presentation of Sekiro, which I think is the most straightforward story in all of the From Software catalog of games. And when I say straightforward, I mean it. Like most of the story is fed to you through dialogue and cutscenes instead of it being hidden behind item descriptions. Although there's a lot of item description in lore in Sekiro as well.
I mean, they have to try and build the world somehow. Uh, just through cutscenes, obviously, isn't their MO. So they're obviously going to put some stuff in there. But for this game, for the feel and the type of game they were trying to portray, they probably do a little more explicit storytelling as opposed to implicit.
And also there's a lot of environmental storytelling. Like you can see the effects of all of these battles in Ashina. You can see the effects of it in the kingdom. You can see some degradation throughout the castle areas, and as the game goes on, you see a lot of more weird stuff going on in the castle. And as they dive deeper and deeper into trying to obtain immortality to defend their kingdom. So I think the lore compared to some of the other games is so much more straightforward, and in which you're essentially going from point A to point B, but you have options. You have multiple options regarding endings depending on how you play. But in the end, it's a fairly straightforward story where you're bet most of the stuff that you end up knowing. There's a big curveball in the end if you don't go for the sure ending, the early ending. But other than that, it's a pretty straightforward story wise, unlike the rest of the Soulsborne or the rest of the From Software game catalog. When we're talking, of course, these types of games, because From Software, those other games like Armored Core and blah blah blah. But I think uh, it's pretty simple to understand the fact that we're referring to this line of games, which is Sekiro and the Soulsborne series. Other than that, I think that the lore is very interesting. I think it's a bit different, but not for the sake of being different than the other games. As I was explaining before, there's a lot of visual storytelling. There's some storytelling in behind items, and a lot of it hidden behind a lot of conversation. But I do think they did a very nice job of, if what they were going for is a game that stays up close to Bloodborne and the Souls game, but being its own thing. I think that both lore wise and visually, they managed that with Sekiro.
Definitely. I also understand that Dark Souls does a lot of their lore. They base a lot of it around like bosses, like characters that have like their own lore attached to them, and then the lore kind of stems out from there. Does Sekiro take that same route with their telling a story around these bosses, and as you fight these bosses, you unlock more of the story, cutscene wise?
I mean, they do that, but not as it's not as widespread or as important as in Dark Souls. Except for some key battles, usually the ones revolving around Ashina Castle. But the problem, or the thing, it's not a problem. The thing with Sekiro is that most of the lore told through battle is revolves around the main characters. That is Genichiro, Owl, and the final boss. Um, Bosses like the Guardian Ape, which for me was one of the most frustrating bosses in all of video games ever. I'm sure a lot of people will share this opinion. Doesn't have a lot of lore attached to it. Only the item he's guarding. Guys like the monk that is a boss you actually fight twice, once in spirit form, once in physical form. I think they could have done a little bit better job explaining his lore. The Eternal Dragon, which I didn't really understand. Like the lore isn't as clear cut because I know you're trying to get a tier from him for a specific purpose, but being I why is he there? It's not as implicit. It's not as explicit as some other stuff in the game. It's more implicit, or you have to do a little more digging to understand the story behind these characters. As in Dark Souls, the soul explains something, or when you have the soul, some other characters will dig a bit deeper into the background of these characters. So I think in general, bosses aren't, with certain exceptions, aren't as important story tools as they are in the rest of these kinds of games for From Software.
And that's partially to be expected when they were trying to go off the beaten path here. Um, I know you were messing around with that in the game. You're messing around with that snake for a while. You're just kind of sneaking around with it alongside you, and you're trying to hide from it. It's not necessarily a boss battle, but that snake tends to mess up the kids early on.
Yeah, you do end up killing it, and there's some of the lore that has to do with the snake. There's actually two of them, and I remember you can kill one. I don't remember if you can kill the second one. I know you can kill the first one, and they're pretty annoying. But those are also like environmental game mechanics that also incorporate the lore of the games. I think that this game did a better job of mixing implicit lore, explicit lore, and environmental lore and game mechanics into an entire package. Even though the problem with it is that, and this bothers some people, that it didn't feel as personal because you didn't create the character. That's a common complaint I've heard from some people regarding the Sekiro experience. I didn't necessarily feel that way, but I can see where people are coming from. And I think that's a good jumping point to the gameplay and differences in the gameplay when we're speaking about going off the beaten path. First off, remember when I told you that I think Sekiro is actually the world's greatest rhythm game? We were talking about that a couple days ago, and it's part of what inspired the creation of this specific podcast topic. And we're going to talk about some specific aspects regarding combat, exploration, and the risk reward aspect of Sekiro against the rest of the Bloodborne series. And we should start by prefacing that we're not trying to directly state or imply that Sekiro is a Bloodborne, but that it shares a lot of its DNA. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think we already prefaced this in one of our earlier episodes, but safe to do it again.
Yeah, first off, one of the main things that differentiates Sekiro from the rest of the Soulsborne games is the weaponry. You get one weapon, and that is Wolf's Katana. There's no specific build. You have some skills that you can learn, but those don't affect the gameplay loop as much as you think, because this game is actually more geared towards a specific mechanic, and that mechanic, when we're talking specifically combat mechanic, not traversal mechanic, is the parry system. In this game, you have to parry. If you can really parry, you really don't need anything else, because most attacks can be parried. The attacks that can't be parried can be dodged, and there are certain skills which I would consider as necessities. For example, the counter to thrust attacks, and some of the other more important traversal or assassination stuff. But other than that, it's all based around this core mechanic about parrying. First off, there are two types of parries. You have your regular parry and you have a perfect parry. The difference between the two of them is that a perfect parry, it does a lot less poise damage. And poise is is implemented in a much more different way than the Souls games, and I think it's a good point to explain it now. And essentially, for enemies to die, or at least bosses, because you can outright just hit the normal enemies with your sword until they die. But you have to apply what's called a death blow, and that happens when an enemy's poise is broken. So usually a boss, you have to break its poise multiple times in order to kill them, and even some of the sub bosses. And there are two ways to increase an enemy's poise bar. One of them is by direct attack and lowering its HP, and the second way to do it is by parrying. And in the end, your objective isn't outright lowering the enemy's HP, but rather breaking their guard by destroying their poise bar. You have one poise bar for yourself. Perfect parries never end up with you having with your guard being broken. If your guard is broken, you are vulnerable, completely vulnerable for a little bit, and you take significantly increased damage. But in this game, the parry is such a strong defensive option that you can essentially, if you're good enough at it, you are essentially invincible in a 1v1 battle, as can be demonstrated in a lot of YouTube videos. You have some of those Sekiro parry gods that can just absolutely wreck enemies without even touching their HP. So, other than that, I think that combat being so parry oriented is a very, I wouldn't say it's odd. I think it's a daring combat choice, and it had a lot of people who were coming off of other Souls games like so much whining about it. There are a bunch of game journalists and people. Oh, this game's too hard. This game's too hard. Well, it was different from the Souls games. It also had a traversal element that really wasn't that easy. But as it pertains to combat, it's so different. You only have one weapon, and it's mostly about parry system, not attacking, not necessarily positioning, just a very strong defensive option that doubles as an offensive option as well. Your offensive options are technically more limited because what you have are some ninja tools. Ninja tools are pretty cool, but they kind of function like guns and Bloodborne in the fact that you have a finite resource, in this case, soul emblems, that really don't allow you as much freedom with the ninja tools as you would want. That is one of the combat wise, one of the decisions that I really didn't agree with from software on. I think that you should have had the option to use your ninja tools indefinitely, but just have them have more if you used a soul emblem. I think that would have created a more varied gameplay experience. But I think that is also one of the one of the ways they forced you to implement, the parry, not really giving you a long range offensive option that's sustainable. Because if you try to use the shuriken or anything else, eventually you're going to run out of it. Or another defensive option like the umbrella, eventually, which has easier parries, eventually you're gonna run out of that too. So combat wise, I think that they really, really, really tried to make Sekiro its own thing, not only with the parry system and all of the ninja tools. You also have some special attacks that are very similar to weapon arts in Dark Souls 3, but those also use up your soul emblems in general. Some of them don't, but the one that don't aren't as damaging, and they have some niche uses. So I don't think in general the entire package being so focused on both restricting you to the parry system by giving you a finite amount of soul emblems. You can get an item like in Bloodborne that increases your soul emblems by sacrificing health, but that is obtained a lot further into the game, and I don't think it's as useful or as blood bullets are because of how much you need to spam your ninja tools or your let's call them weapon arts as much as you would like to.
So
And
Rafa,
that yes,
do you think that they could do better by this game if they maybe buffed a lot of the other weapon arts, or and without sacrificing a lot of the difficulty that you can abbreviate from the parrying system?
I think that the point is that what they should have done isn't necessarily buffing some of the stuff because that cheapens the experience. I think what they should have done was balance the ninja tools a bit better to give you a more options in combat. So maybe some long range options, or maybe just more utility from other weapons. Or not other weapons, but some of the other ninja tools. I think that a lot of the ninja tools become very niche because you want to use them, but you don't want to waste soul emblems, or you don't think they're strong enough to warrant the soul emblem use or being equipped, or you want to save up your whatever it is. They just don't give you that many offensive options as they do in the Soul series, where you also have some other offensive items that you can purchase in order to diversify essentially the combat gameplay loop. But there's something very important we haven't touched upon besides your arsenal and how restrictive the combat system actually is. And it is of the namesake system of the game, which is Shadows Die Twice. And it's the fact that you can die multiple times in this game. And it's essentially a system where upon death you can actually revive one or multiple times depending on certain factors, usually how many enemies you've killed. And initially you can revive only once, but you can increase the number of times you can revive per, let's call it, not playthrough, let's call it per journey. It's called per journey. um and that's a nice feature to have, and it actually presents some interesting gameplay options where with the implementation of the stealth system you can actually die and the enemy will lose sight of you. You'll wake up and you'll be able to get a free death blow on them. That system isn't so hard to explain. It's just that you die, you can revive even multiple times through the use of this game mechanic. But that also brings us, and we've mentioned this before, to the stealth mechanic, which is a very nice mechanic. I really like it, but I think they could have implemented it a little more, a little better, because and a little more. throughout gameplay actually, because I think the enemy AI is, you can manipulate the enemy AI, and it's kind of stupid. You can be right in front of it without being hiding, and you can still get a death blow off of it. I think they may not have had enough time, or maybe didn't find a good enough way to implement this um in a more, let's call it, fleshed out manner, because after all that's not the focus of the game. It's just a different approach to it. And but I think it's a nice inclusion to have. What do you think of the stealth system?
I think for the intention for it was to more or less work as a positioning tool. Because in this game, you're walking up on like a large group of enemies in certain areas. You'll be like the castle, like in and around the castle. There's these large groups of enemies so that if you get jumped from all angles, I don't care how good at parrying you are. But
Yeah,
there's a lot of enemies like the mid bosses you talked about and the actual bosses. You can't stealth them anyway, so it doesn't really make sense to just shit on the stealth aspect of it. It's really just for getting around, so you can get around certain enemies if you
re-
don't want to fight them, if you want to go somewhere else.
do remember that you can actually stealth one. You can stealth death blow one of the HP bars from most of the mid bosses,
That's
and
one
you
of them.
can, and you also, like, if you're good enough, you can some of the ghost enemies, the weird ghost enemies that fly around, you can actually death blow one of their health bars, and then you can anti-air death blow the second one. So
All
yeah,
right.
I
I
mean
guess I
that
guess it's pretty cheap then.
you you, you did mention before the verticality aspect of it, and the verticality does lend itself to more of a stealthy approach, because what I was talking about was mostly the ground stealth, like hiding in bushes and stuff like that. I think it's much better implemented as it pertains to swinging around, and that's the other gameplay aspect that we're entering right now is your prosthetic arm, which isn't only used as an offensive tool, but also to add verticality and being able to swing around most of the environment. Of course, you also have a straight jump and a wall jump that both gain significant height. So just you have so much more freedom to move around the environment than some of the other From Software games. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure, wasn't it From Software that or a subsidiary that actually created the Tenchu Stealth Ninja games? I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was.
Can't recall.
And well, a lot of these mechanics were actually used in this Tenchu series of games. And in general, I again the stealth system is a bit of a mixed bag for me. I think that when it's applied in terms of verticality, you hiding among the rooftops or above enemies when they aren't looking, it's much better implemented that when you're down on the ground. So in general, I think that Sekiro is its own thing. I think that if you take the time to learn the parry system, even though it's restrictive and it pissed a lot of people off, I think mostly people who are used to maybe playing Dark Souls with a ranged character or a mage, or people just didn't parry in general. Even though if you were a person who had a lot of experience with dodging, you would be able to adapt much better to this parry system regarding Sekiro. But again, in general, I think it's its own thing. I think it's a great game. I do think it lacks some variety in combat. It's mostly restricted by the fact that they tied down both weapon arts, your sword skills, and your prosthetic ninja tools, specifically to soul emblems, with which are a finite resource. But overall, I think that that's its own thing. I think Sekiro is a great game. If I had to grade it by itself, not on a curve compared to the rest of the Souls games, I'd actually give it a 9 out of 10. It was a very enjoyable experience for me. I finished that game around 7 or 8 times. I'm not a platinum hunter, but I decided as soon as I started playing it that I would gain a platinum on Sekiro, and I did. What are your final thoughts on the game?
I would have to agree. The learning curve, especially for a lot of these bosses, I died a ton to Owl. Like I had to go at him for like an entire night and then part of the next day. He was by far the hardest boss I've ever fought from all these Dark Souls games. But that being said, a lot of people came into this game thinking it was going to be Dark Souls but Japanese. And kind of to an extent, but I don't think they were expecting this. But I definitely like this game. I really like most of these Japanese games, the ninja stuff. I just get into that kind of style, and I think it was also 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I think also we didn't a disclaimer, we didn't really go into the boss design of combat because there's not really that much of a difference between battling mobs and battling the mid bosses and actual bosses here because it's so centered around the parry system. But with that, Kenton, I think this was a good breakdown of Sekiro as a game, and wish that if a couple of people listen to this game, that listen to this podcast, and haven't played the game, maybe they'll feel like playing it because it's really a great game and shouldn't be discouraged by all of the whining from journalists about it being too hard. Because really, if you get into the parry system, it's not any harder than any of the other Souls games.
Did they plan on coming out with any DLC for this, or is it way too late for that?
No, there's DLC, but the DLC is mostly boss rushes, not outright new content. It's
Oh,
they
okay.
just made a bunch of boss rushes that give you um some specific rewards. And the hardest of the boss rushes, which is probably the hardest thing you can you can find in gaming right now, did the most from software thing they could ever do. And when you finish it, you get nothing.
You get the satisfaction, and you'll like it.
It gives you nothing. Just the satisfaction of telling people that you finished it. Doesn't give you anything.
And people are
That's
gonna
a
be like, "What the hell are you talking about? What's Sekiro? I don't know."
So this was the breakdown of Sekiro in its most important aspects. We may be doing a more in-depth look on Sekiro's bosses in a later edition of our podcast. But I think that's enough for today. And as usual, stay locked on Lordran.